Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along today. It's great to be joined by my two colleagues in the Treasury, David Gauke, our Financial Secretary, Priti, Patel, the Exchequer Secretary. And today we have a month to go to the general election. At stake is the future direction of our country, whether we move forward with a plan that is working or go back to the chaotic economic situation Britain found itself in 5 years ago. And we talk about many important issues in this election: more jobs, higher incomes, a strong NHS, our national security. All of these things depend ultimately on one thing, which is economic security. Because without economic security, jobs are lost. Without economic security, incomes are cut. Without economic security, we can't pay for a strong NHS and ensure our national security. And through hard work and difficult decisions and sacrifices, we have won that economic security for Britain. We have confronted a situation where our country was borrowing £1 in every 4 that it spent. We have halved our deficit, and this year got our national debt falling as a share of our national income for the first time in 13 years. We've made employment easier, business taxes more competitive, and reached out across the world to win business for Britain. The result is economic security. And it's not an abstract concept. You can see the security in the jobs that businesses are creating for people who are unemployed and giving up hope. You can see it in the rising living standards and the consumer confidence at a 12-year high, because the confidence of families about their future is higher. But economic security is a fragile thing, hard won, easily lost. Look at our neighbours in Europe, who have lost the confidence of businesses and investors and markets. See the price paid in their unemployment rolls. See the struggle their governments face to win that economic security back. Britain has economic security, and we don't want to lose it again. And that's why in the budget last month, I set out what we needed to do to finish the job. The £30 billion of future savings we'll need to find in the next 2 years to balance the day-to-day budget of the government, the discipline we need to show after that so government spending remains under control and we raise more than we spend, running a surplus to pay down our national debt in good years so we're ready when the storms come. And in this election, and in the months before it, we've been asked a lot of questions about our plan, rightly so. And we've explained how we believe we can achieve it. The £13 billion of savings in departments, the £12 billion from welfare, the £5 billion from tax avoidance, evasion and planning, all similar in proportion to the savings we found in this Parliament. We need to save £1 in every £100 we spend. And it's part of a balanced package to eliminate the deficit, reduce our debt, increase funding to our NHS, and make work pay with tax cuts for working people. But what I want to address today is the alternative. Because if you reject our plan, then you must have an alternative one. And if you don't want to cut spending, then you must want to raise taxes and increase borrowing. That is the only logical alternative. But while I'm prepared to stand here and say, yes, the Conservative plan involves saving money, my opponents are not prepared to admit that their alternative means higher taxes and more borrowing. So today we want to clearly and logically take you through the alternative on offer in this election. And if our opponents think we've got their position wrong, they can correct us and tell us what their real position is on tax and spending and borrowing. Now the analysis shows that Ed Miliband and Ed Balls want to increase taxes by £15 billion, then borrow £30 billion more a year than the plan we've set out. And the cost of that in extra debt interest payments for the extra borrowing is over £3 billion in the next Parliament alone. And in my judgment, that extra borrowing will undermine confidence, those extra taxes will hit family incomes, and the extra debt interest will divert money from public services. In other words, we will start to lose the hard-won economic security we have established in Britain. Now let me take you through the analysis in some detail. First, higher taxes. Now, the Labour Party voted in January for the government's Charter of Budget Responsibility to try and convince everyone that they could be responsible with the budget. They didn't have to vote for the Charter. Indeed, the SNP made a point of refusing to vote for the Charter. And as a result, the SNP are committed to much higher borrowing and debt. Parties who voted for the Charter were voting to eliminate the current structural budget deficit by 2017-18, 3 years from now. Now that's the deficit on day-to-day government spending the economic growth by itself won't eliminate. And we agree, the Liberal Democrats agree, the Treasury number shows, the Institute of Fiscal Studies confirm that if you want to eliminate the current structural budget deficit within 3 years, you need £30 billion of spending and welfare savings, or 30 billion of tax rises, or a mix of the two. And I've said already, we've explained how we'd break the 30 billion down. The Liberal Democrats have also set out their approach, with many more tax rises. The Labour Party has dodged and ducked the question. No answer. What we have to go on is the repeated confirmation from the likes of Ed Balls and Ed Miliband that taxes will have to rise. And we have Ed Miliband repeatedly telling the Labour Party, when he was seeking to be their leader, that he thought the right balance between tax rises and spending cuts when it comes to eliminating deficits is 50-50. Fewer spending and welfare cuts are certainly implied every single time a Labour Party spokesperson complains about our approach. Now, if Ed Miliband changes his position, we will listen, but in the absence of that, we will take him at his word. And if you voted for a £30 billion deficit reduction plan over 2 years, and you want to achieve half of it by raising taxes, then that's £15 billion of tax rises by the second year. In the first year, you'll have got halfway there. The question then is, which taxes will be increased? For £15 billion of tax rises is a hefty amount. £865 each year per working family, £3,028 over the Parliament. Now, the Labour Party have talked about all sorts of tax rises. Higher corporation tax, taxes on pensions, levies on tobacco companies, taxes on family homes. There's only one problem. The revenue from every single one of these tax rises has been allocated to pay for another Labour policy, as you will see. So, they've used all their tax rises to pay for Labour policy, all except one, raising the top rate of income tax. Now, in Labour's world, that raises £3 billion. In the world of the actual HM Revenue and Customs, it raises nothing. And the Institute of Fiscal Studies, so often quoted by the Labour Party when it suits, said last month that based on the latest data, the HMRC estimates remain the best estimates. But either way, it leaves the Labour sums billions of pounds out. And here's the truth you learn as Chancellor. You can't raise £15 billion of tax, or anything close to it, by taxing expensive homes or hitting bankers' pay. The only way to raise a sum like that is by increasing one of the big taxes, or indeed a combination of three. And they would have to put up employee national insurance, employer national insurance, the jobs tax, and freeze the personal allowance for the whole Parliament. These are the kinds of tax rises you need to raise £15 billion. And where do these tax rises fall? On working families. £15 billion is £3,000 for every working family. So the alternative to our plan is big tax increases for the first 2 years, £3,000 higher taxes on working families. But the differences don't stop there. Once the current budget is in balance, our plan is to go further and run an overall surplus in good years. And it's very easy to explain. When the economy is growing and we're not in recession, we should be raising more than we spend. That's the way proven around the world to bear down on your national debt and best prepare yourself for any future economic storms, fixing the roof while the sun is shining. Now, the Labour Party don't want to do that. They only talk about balancing the current day-to-day spending while continuing to borrow to pay for capital spending. And what they don't tell you is that that means a permanent, never-ending budget deficit, year after year, spending more than we raise. Well, how much more? In 2018-19, we've said we'd spend £30 billion a year on capital investment. So assuming that Labour don't want to spend less than us on capital investment, that means borrowing at least £30 billion a year and rising. A £30 billion budget deficit forever into the future. But borrowing costs and deficits don't come for free. You have to pay interest on what you borrow, interest to those around the world who lend the British government money. And those interest payments come out of the same pot of money we have to fund our NHS or pay for our army and do all the other things we want government to pay for. So if you borrow £30 billion a year extra, you have to find more money for debt interest payments. Well, how much? Let me tell you today. Over £3 billion more in debt interest payments in just 2 years. That's using the OBR's forecast for interest rates, and of course this is at a time when rates are historically low. £3 billion extra in debt interest payments to Britain's creditors, instead of £3 billion to Britain's NHS or Britain's schools, or repaid to Britain's taxpayers. So that's the alternative on offer in 1 month's time. Higher taxes, a never-ending deficit, higher debt interest, our economic security put at risk. No wonder the business leaders of Britain, from the largest companies to the small ones, from those who have supported the Labour Party in the past to those who have supported no party, are speaking out. No wonder the Labour Party spokespeople dare not speak the truth about the higher taxes and more debt they'd impose. That is the alternative. But Britain doesn't have to take it. Britain has a choice. Higher taxes with Ed Miliband, carrying on borrowing billions indefinitely, or we can stick with a plan that is working, the Conservatives' long-term economic plan, and the security it brings to the families of this country now and in the future. Thank you very much. Let me ask David to speak and then Priti to speak as well. David.
Thank you, Chancellor. So there we have it. For all Ed Miliband's promises to balance the books, he would run a deficit, permanently adding to debt every year, forever. By talking about achieving a surplus on the current budget, Ed Miliband and Ed Balls probably thought this was a clever sleight of hand that nobody would notice. But after 13 years at Gordon Brown's side, people can now see straight through them. That's why, as the general campaign has begun, Labour's claims have fallen apart under scrutiny. There have been 3 key moments. Ed Miliband's campaign chief, Lucy Powell, was the first to let the cat out of the bag. She was forced to admit that Labour's policy meant that they may use some investment borrowing. So much for Ed Miliband's pledge that there will be no additional borrowing to fund their spending promises. Second, Shadow Business Secretary Chuka Umunna was confronted on the Today programme with analysis from the Institute of Fiscal Studies showing that Labour would still be running a £30 billion budget deficit in 2020. He was asked 7 times whether Labour would still have an overall budget deficit by the end of the next Parliament, and 7 times he failed to deny it. Unlike the head of Labour's HQ's campaign, he at least managed to follow Labour HQ's instructions not to use the B word. Finally, a shadow Treasury Minister, Shabana Mahmood, said that Labour may not even balance the current budget until 2023, 8 years from now. So my challenge for Ed Miliband and Ed Balls today is this. Stop taking the British people for fools. If your policy is to borrow more, then say you would borrow more. Going around making promises to balance the books when you have absolutely no intention of doing so is a fraud, pure and simple. The truth is that Ed Miliband has learned nothing from his mistakes. That's why when Jeremy Paxman asked him if Labour had spent too much in office, he said no. Even when Labour entered the recession with a structural deficit of £73 billion, the biggest in the G7 on IMF figures, Ed Miliband still doesn't think Labour spent and borrowed too much. If Ed Miliband has learnt nothing from the mistakes of the past, he doesn't have a plan for the future. And it's our children who will pay the price with more debt than they could ever hope to repay. I'll now hand over to Priti, who will explain the cost of the extra debt interest Ed Miliband plans to rack up.
Thank you, David. Ed Miliband's debt-fueled spending increases have a price. That price is £3 billion more of extra debt interest payments by 2020. This is money that could be spent on schools, hospitals, or the police. But instead, it's £3 billion of taxpayers' money that is handed over to foreign creditors. You could say that it's Ed Miliband's banker's bonus. Let's be clear what £3 billion could pay for. It could pay for more staff on the front line of our public services. That's 100,000 more nurses, 50,000 more doctors, 93,000 more teachers, or 79,000 policemen or women. It could be used to pay for essential infrastructure, such as 700,000 primary school places, or 85,000 prison places, or even 400 new trains for our country's network. Or it could simply be put back into hard-working people's pockets through tax cuts. It could pay for almost a penny off the basic rate of income tax, almost a penny of national insurance, or a £500 increase in the tax-free personal allowance. It's taxpayers' money that should be returned to every working household in Britain. But instead, Ed Miliband wants every working family to pay this money to bankers so that he can borrow more money to spend on welfare. Ed Miliband is not on the side of Britain's hard-working taxpayers. They will pay the price of Labour's borrowing, debt and waste, a price that will be even higher with the SNP in charge. The choice at this election is clear. It's competence at a better future with our balanced long-term economic plan, or chaos with Ed Miliband propped up by Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond and the SNP. That is the choice on May the 7th.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Priti. Now let's have some questions. We've got some colleagues here from the media. I'm sure will want to ask some questions as well. Nick Watt from The Guardian.
Thank you, Chancellor. You're saying that the Labour Party is not being straightforward with us about the tax increases they'll have to introduce in the next Parliament, but do you not need to be straightforward with us? You're declining to say how nearly half of your 30 billion fiscal consolidation will come about. You've said there'll be 12 billion of welfare cuts, but you haven't yet told us how those will come about. And is it also not the case that Labour have not signed up to a £30 billion fiscal consolidation? What they've done in the Charter for Budget Responsibility is to sign up to an amended version of your June 2010 fiscal mandate. That was to have a rolling 5-year forward guidance on the fiscal target. That's now gone down to 3 years. And as you've shown in the last Parliament, you can fail to meet your target, which is the elimination of the budget deficit, the structural budget deficit, and still be within your fiscal mandate. And so it's not a 30 billion target they've signed up to.
Well, I mean, first of all, look, as I say, we have set out how we would achieve the £30 billion of consolidation, and that £30 billion is a number accepted not only by ourselves and, of course, the Liberal Democrats, and indeed part of the Treasury analysis of the Charter, but it's also what the IFS, when they looked at it, thought was the right amount. And we've set out the 13 billion with safe and departments, 12 billion from welfare, the 5 billion from tax avoidance and evasion, so we've been straight about that. When it comes to welfare, we've already saved 21 billion in this Parliament. We've given examples of further savings we can make, like freezing working age benefits. We have set out what principles we'll apply, protecting the most vulnerable, as we have in this Parliament, where, for example, we were able to increase payments to the most disabled, safeguarding pensioners, and of course we've made commitments on that front, and saying, look, work has to pay, and the job of reforming welfare has not finished. So we've set out vastly more detail than the Labour Party, who have not said anything about the taxes they would raise or the borrowing they would commit to. And if they don't want to commit to the 30 billion, fine, but then tell us what their alternative is. As I said, there was a choice in that vote. The SNP chose not to vote with us and said they weren't signing up to that. The Labour Party chose to vote with us, so it's not as if it was a vote that no one noticed or didn't make a judgment on. And as I say, if the Labour Party are committed to the Charter, It is to seek that current budget balance, current structural budget balance in 3 years' time, and that's 2017-18, that's the 30 billion. If they want to do half of it with tax rises, that's 15 billion, and that's how you work out these numbers. Now, they can come to me and say, actually, we agree with the Conservatives, we would do it all through spending and welfare and tax avoidance, but they haven't said that. They could say, actually, you know what, we're tearing up this charter, we don't agree with it, but they voted for it. Either way, they've got to explain, if you're not committed to our savings, then you must be committed either to tax increases or borrowing increases. It's a very sort of straightforward, logical question for them, and they have not yet provided any answers to it. So another question. Andy Dunn.
Thank you, Andy Dunn, 5 News. Chancellor, Tony Blair is saying today the quickest route to economic chaos is the 2 years of uncertainty leading up to a Europe referendum. He's right on that, isn't he? That's what a Conservative government would plunge us into.
Well, first of all, the record of the last government of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, of course, was to leave the country ill-prepared for the economic crash. But look, it's interesting to see Tony Blair turning up in this general election. I suspect he's going to do the absolute minimum required not to be blamed for Labour's defeat when it comes. And I think he's doing a good service to us all today by, first of all, advertising the fact that if you vote Conservative, you get a referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union, and second, by refusing to appear alongside the Labour leader and indeed putting himself on the other end of the country, advertising the fact that he thinks the Labour leader is weak.
But you must accept there'll be investment consequences leading up to that referendum. Countries will be wary about investing in Britain.
Well, look, we've had this question many times. We had this question when we first announced the policy. And since then, we've attracted the lion's share of investment into Europe, and we've created more jobs than the rest of Europe put together. So investors and businesses are voting with their feet by voting with the British economy, voting to create jobs here, conscious that we've got a plan that works. Joe.
Chancellor, you've been described as a dangerous man who's lurching to the right, planning savage, ideologically driven cuts on the backs of the poor, and all this by your number 2 in the Treasury, Danny Alexander. What did you do to upset him during 5 years ago?
Well, look, Danny Alexander is a Liberal Democrat. He comes from a different political party, and I know people still struggle after 5 years of this coalition to accept that there were 2 parties in the government. We now want a majority Conservative government. Of course, he's campaigning for the Liberal Democrats to get elected at this election. I think what you'll see from Liberal Democrats increasingly are them saying increasingly desperate things to get noticed and get some attention and try and elbow their way into the coverage of this campaign. But the truth is this, and they know it, that there is only really one choice in this election, which is, do you want David Cameron in Downing Street or Ed Miliband in Downing Street? Do you want the Conservative plan that we have set out today, or the alternative which we have described today? That is the real choice in this election. And so, as I say, the Liberal Democrats, like other minority or minor parties in this election, are going to say things to try and grab the headlines. I think the public are going to be focused on the big choice. We've still got another question. Sam.
Chancellor, we welcome scrutiny of your plans. On welfare and the £12 billion aspiration to get welfare saved for the next Parliament, you haven't set out where that's coming from. One big area that could get you a lot of money is wrapping child benefit into the universal credit system. The advantage is that could get you up to £6 billion, but it would mean a dramatic reduction in the number of people that could therefore claim child benefit. Could you rule out that as a possible option for you after the election? And just on Scotland, there's a focus like never before on what's going on up there. The SNP have asked for all sorts of further types of devolution, be that national insurance contributions, tax incentives, personal allowance, welfare, and the right to control welfare. Can you envisage any circumstances in which you extend the offer and expand on what the Smith Commission put forward and give Scots even greater powers than that?
Well, look, I've already explained the position on welfare. You can look at our track record, the £21 billion we've saved in this Parliament. You can look at the principles we'll apply to future such savings. And as I say, this is perfectly achievable, and anyone who thinks that the job of reforming welfare has somehow been completed, I think is mistaken. You know, we want to go on creating a welfare system that rewards work and the aspirations of families and protects the most vulnerable. On Scotland, look, we have a very big task ahead in the next Parliament, not to be underestimated, which is to implement the recommendations of the Smith Commission, and that is a huge task. It's going to require a lot of work getting the legislation through. It is a massive transfer of power and responsibility to the elected representatives of the Scottish people, and we came together as all political parties, including the Scottish Nationalists, to agree that package. So I think that is now the task. Rather than moving on to the next thing, let's focus on the big job in hand. And you know, it's going to be one of the big new tasks for a government elected after May to get that legislation designed, and indeed to get agreed with the Scottish Government the fiscal arrangements that underpin it, which won't be so much in the legislation, but more are an agreement between the Westminster Government and the Holyrood Government. I've made the point before, but I make it again today, which is you want a Chancellor Exchequer and a government that is negotiating for the whole United Kingdom in that deal. You don't want a Chancellor who is beholden to the votes of the SNP in the House of Commons, because you're not going to get a fair deal for the whole United Kingdom when you're negotiating this crucial agreement that has to be done really in the months after the general election. Second.
David, you wrote yesterday, well, over the weekend to Sandra Journal at the UK Stats Authority complaining about some of Ed Miliband's claims have been warranted. I wondered if you'd heard a response yet and what you're expecting when Sir Andrew replies to you.
I've not received a response. I mean, the suggestion that living standards are somehow plummeting, when we've seen clearly again and again, most recently with the ONS numbers, that living standards are moving in the right direction. I think it is an important point, which is why I've contacted Sir Andrew.
Right, another couple of questions. Gentleman on
Michael Seckel from the Herald. Another Scottish question, I'm afraid. Many people think that the SNP surge is unstoppable. What on earth can the Conservatives do to stop it? And following the row over the memo regarding the meeting between Nicola Sturgeon and the French ambassador, can you give people an assurance that the Tories won't use the issue in the government to play dirty tricks?
Well, first of all, I can absolutely give you the assurance that we will play by the fair rules established by the civil service, and indeed, as I understand it, it's of course not my responsibility, but the Cabinet Secretary is quite correctly conducting an investigation into how that leak or the appearance of that note into the public domain came about. That's, you know, I think we can, as I say, rely on the Cabinet Secretary to be impartial in this approach. When it comes to the SNP, look, I've got a very good answer, which is vote Conservative. You know, we have a really good leader in Scotland, in Ruth Davidson. I think she has been the outstanding leader of the unionist cause, both in the referendum and now in the general election. And she has revived the Scottish Conservative Party. She is offering a clear alternative, not just to the Scottish nationalism that wants to break up our country, but also to the tired and hollowed out Labour Party in Scotland. So we've got a good answer, and I think Ruth has been one of the star performers of recent months, and is, from what I see, being a star performer in this election campaign as well. And that's the best answer. Michael.
Michael Crick from Channel 4 News. Following up Sam's question, I noticed you didn't rule out the suggestion that child benefit might be rolled up into universal credit. Can you rule out depriving more people of child credit like you've already done during the course of this Parliament?
Well, as I say, you can judge us on our approach in this Parliament, and if we'd wanted to put child benefit into the universal credit, we would have done it when we set up universal credit. So we've got a track record, we've got a plan that is based on clear principles about making work pay and sharpening work incentives. And look, we took a decision yesterday, beginning of the tax year, to freeze the. Well, I've just given you a very clear answer. If we'd wanted to do it, we would have done it when we created
Just say,
universal
yes, I'm
credit.
ruling it out.
I've given you a very clear answer, Michael, and you have to be a contortionist to think that I'm not giving a pretty clear answer to that question. But we've set out the principles that we will apply. You can see from our track record, we've created a welfare system where child poverty is down, inequality is down, we have a record low number of workless households, and what we are doing is creating a welfare system where it pays to work and where we protect the most vulnerable, and we're going to go on doing that in the next Parliament. But let me end on this observation. You can't achieve any of these things without economic security, without a strong and growing economy, and without a plan to deal with your public finances and keep them in good order. And that enables us to make commitments to things like real increases in the National Health Service. Just before I came in the room, I saw that Andy Burnham could not make a commitment to the NHS's own plan for its future, produced by Simon Stevens. He said he couldn't write a cheque for that. That is the plan that the NHS has itself produced. It's a plan we have confidence in. It's a plan the NHS have confidence in. And he can't write cheques to the NHS because he hasn't got an economic plan to fund them. Thank you very much.